So a little bit about this session, Design for Humans. This really comes off the back of feedback following a lot of courses that we've run on user experience for L&D teams, picking out the bits, sort of what I describe as like the golden nuggets from what we've done with teams. Things that have made a really big impact is what we're going to touch on today. And I do mean touch on. UX is a huge field, as big as L&D itself. And so we cannot possibly explore it meaningfully in an hour. What we can do is try and pick out some really great things that we can use to improve our work. I'm going to speak pretty specifically in the context of digital learning content, so e-learning, but a lot of this is applicable outside of that realm. So let's dive in. And again, anything you want to shout out, please do in the Q&A, which I'll try and keep open. I think I can. Yes, lovely. So the obvious place to start then is this concept of UX, user experience, often attached with a slash to a UI, arguably not a great idea. But we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say user experience. So, user experience is not user interface. User experience is not button placement, though that's part of a user experience. User experience is not any one thing. It is all aspects of a person's interaction with a product, service, or company. For us, that means every learning or training product that we create, every piece of e-learning, every workshop, every trip to the LMS, everything we put on the intranet page, everything we print out, laminate, and stick to a wall or give people to put on their desk. All of those are learning products. And every time someone interacts with them, whether it's successfully, unsuccessfully, frustratedly, that is a measure of their user experience. This isn't my definition, just to be clear. I've taken it word for word from Don Norman, who is kind of the godfather of user experience and well worth sort of looking up. He actually has a free book available as a Kindle version, which is a real sort of good primer for anyone looking into user experience for the first time. And I would say that a lot of what we're going to cover today is probably best aimed at those getting started with UX considerations. If you are, a sort of veteran of user experience design or have worked in product for a long period of time or anything like that, you're probably not going to hear anything new. But we are going to be shaping it to the context of sort of e-learning and digital learning design. So a couple of notable things then. We're going to talk a lot about things like the holistic experience, the whole thing, basically. There are going to be times in the session where I ask slightly annoying kind of what I describe as wanky philosophical questions, but they are important. I'm not asking them to make us sit and think deep thoughts and look up at the stars and stroke our beards and have white marble statues of ourselves carved at some point in the future and put in a pantheon somewhere. UX is a phenomenal tool for L&D professionals to broaden their view. Now, we're always told in L&D, we need to be more like product, marketing, data, UX, insert other whole profession here. Now, there are things in all of those fields that we can steal, that we can learn from, but this is not me advocating for us all becoming user experience professionals. I mean, arguably, everyone is a user experience professional because we all create things that people experience, but we do not all need to go, this is it. This is what I need to know. I need to pursue this to the nth degree. We do not all need to go and pursue UX qualifications and take tons and tons of time. It's about learning enough to take, as I say, the nuggets, the things that we know work for our context. Context is another thing that's going to come up a lot in this. And it means that some of the stuff we talk about will apply wildly differently for different people on the call. And that's okay. Very little in UX, just as in L&D, is absolute. In fact, really very little is absolute at all in anything any of us do. There will always be a context that requires us to move away from what we might consider to be best practice. I've got a very strong belief that all best practice is something that worked in some other places. And whenever we apply it to our own context, we need to be ready to contextualize it, to adjust it, because making it work is so much more important than being aligned with what others consider to be best practice. Most importantly, though, user experience and everything we discussed today is about meeting the need. It's about putting the user, the human being that we exist to support, at the very center of our decision-making process, of every design decision that we make. And that sounds very simple. But then we start throwing around words like, oh, the learner. How many of the people, the human beings that we support would self-identify as a learner or the learner in this particular context? I would argue very few. The learner also assumes that, well, first of all, learning's happening, that learning can be imposed on another person through a process. So instead, we're going to try and use the term, in this session at least, the user. It's slightly less loaded outside of, certain circumstances. It's not perfect. It's still referring to people as a role they don't themselves identify as, though most people would accept that they are the user of a product or service, certainly more so than many people in work would assume the role of I am a learner in this context. So that's a little bit on language and a little bit on definitions before we get started. So let's kick off with one of those annoying philosophical questions. What in your environment is not a designed experience? What in your environment is not a designed experience? This is a really interesting question. And it's one that was asked me when age ago when I first did a course. And I immediately thought, well, loads of stuff's not designed. Absolutely tons of stuff. When I go for a walk through the woods, no one's designed that. The trees decided how they were going to grow. They just happen to have grown that way. Well, that's true. But who put the path there? The path didn't grow. The path wasn't naturally occurring. Even the little tracks that deviate from the council-issued path, which is always a straight line for some bizarre reason, off through the trees, has only been established by people deciding, designing it into the landscape. Very little of what we experience has not in some way been designed. That incredible mountain on the picture to the left, of course, was not designed. It's a natural phenomenon that these places occur. We have a somewhat reasonable understanding of how these things happen, but they aren't designed. They are naturally occurring. They can only happen once. A whole series of events had to line up perfectly for this to happen to be the outcome. But you can absolutely bet your bottom dollar someone chose where to put that window, and what kind of window it would be, and how tall that window would be, and how big that room behind the window would be to capture the size and the light coming off that mountain. The experience that crowd of people are having looking at that mountain is heavily designed. The cities in which we live, towns, villages, hamlets, if you want to go even smaller, have been designed. The road systems, the paths, the green spaces that still exist aren't generally there by accident. They're there by choice and design. Very little of the modern world, very little of our day-to-day has not been designed for us. We often think of design as being the color of the button or the background or the nice gradient that I've put on the designed experience text there. Design is the input to all experience. Now, when we think about that in an L&D context, of course, we are not going that broad. We are not designing whole environments often, though we do sometimes get the opportunity. But we do need to consider how the environments that our users are in have been designed? Does that design allow them to engage with the experience we are offering them in a meaningful way? Does the design of the modern workplace actually support performance? Or are there environmental factors impacting it that no amount of training can fix? Our job as L&D professionals often, when we think about design, is not about designing content, but designing the overall working environment, the experience an employee has when trying to complete a task. And when we narrow our field down again to e-learning, which is the focus of today, we must always remain aware that this small piece of design exists within a much larger design of the modern workplace. So with all that in mind, let's start getting into things that, we can use. The big philosophical question is fun, and it's quite an interesting conversation to have with other people if you ever get the opportunity. But let's take a little look at the practical stuff. So this is the user experience honeycomb. And broadly speaking, it considers these kind of 7 things that we talk about a lot in user experience. Notably at the center is the concept of something being valuable. The ultimate goal is that the thing that you create, the experience you design and offer to your user, is valuable to them. Now, the definition of valuable is very mutable here. Valuable could mean worth a lot of money. It could also mean very helpful. It could also mean building potential for the future. Value is, generally speaking, defined by the person going through the experience, not by the person designing it. So what we have to focus on are the things around this, the 6 considerations that make something valuable. Is it useful, usable, and desirable? Anyone working in products will be familiar with the idea of the UUD framework. Something needs to first be useful, then it needs to be usable, and then it needs to be desirable for it to be successful. Here, there are first 3 considerations. And certainly when we think about learning, we need to think about, of course, it needs to be useful. It needs to solve the problem. It needs to meet the need. It needs to be usable. If people can't use the experience, then it's irrelevant. Desirable is a funny one, and I think is largely misunderstood and misapplied in our space. Making something desirable doesn't mean filling it with jokes, making it fun. It doesn't mean turning it into a video game. It doesn't mean filling it with animations necessarily. Desirable really needs to be rethought as people choosing to do it. Often they have no real choice, but they shouldn't resent the fact that they are doing it. We do not need to, as people say, like compete with Netflix or compete with YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or any stuff. That's not the workplace context. Most employees in a real work environment do not have the choice to go, I'm just going to sit here on Netflix instead, actually. That's not, and we all kind of know this, though we don't talk about it enough, that is not the real working world. In the real world, if someone goes, I'm just going to sit here and watch Netflix, their manager shows up pretty quickly. When no work's getting done, customers are getting angry, productivity's dropped, whatever the happening is following them doing that. So instead of using these really quite sort of simple versions of desirability, we need to think about desirability in the workplace context. Thus, we talk about useful a lot more. Usefulness and relevance will drive desirability. Brevity will drive desirability. Making things as easy as is reasonable for them will drive desirability. Making things as quick as is reasonable will drive desirability. Desirability does not mean people wanting to do it in their free time, at home, in the bath on Sunday. We are not building entertainment. We are building support for performance. We are trying to facilitate performance in everything that we do. Again, often misapplied, but still a valuable thing to think about. Then we go to our bottom three, which are a little bit different, but actually really important. Findable. Can people find the bloody thing? This is a surprisingly common problem. If anyone has tried to use the search function in many LMSs recently, you will have felt this pain. Well, there's not actually a space there in the title, so we can't find the course in any way at all. That should not be a thing in 2025, but it is. It's a great example of another design impacting and invalidating any work you've put into your design. Doesn't matter how good the content is, if no one can find it because the LMS search is bad or the intranet's broken or whatever, doesn't matter. Credible. Is your content credible? Do people perceive your content as a valuable source of information that they can trust? That sounds obvious, right? Of course you can trust the L&D team. They never make a mistake. If anyone's using an LLM to produce the copy for their e-learning, this would be something to be aware of. I am not an anti-AI person, but we have a credibility problem when we start trusting the stuff these engines spit out. Lots of people this last week have been talking about, all of a sudden, all the LLMs are talking completely differently and making things up a lot more and all this kind of thing. That's not a bug. Hallucination is a feature. It's all hallucination. So we really need to, this isn't just an AI related point. Credibility can be just as bad. Humans make just as many mistakes, usually with, to be honest, less excuse. We could have gone to the SME, but we don't really like working with that SME. So we just kind of looked at the document and kind of made sense of it ourselves with all our incredible level of expertise in, I don't know, clinical cleaning or whatever it might be. And now, we've misinformed hospital cleaners all over the country. That's a real example that I came across quite recently. We are incredibly human in what we do. And so these things are very easy to say and make fun of stood here on my webinar. But when you're the person in the role, these things don't happen in, I don't care about the credibility of my work. They happen in, I cannot go through another meeting with that SME. I think I get this. I'm just going to go. Small incremental decisions are what erode our credibility in the space. So that's a super important one that we never let slip. And finally, one we're all familiar with, accessibility. Is content accessible? We often think that accessibility is this little kind of out on its own element. It's often kind of seen that way in the learning design world. It's not. It exists as a big, big component of user experience. If an experience is not accessible, it's not valuable. Notably, these 6 are all required for something to be considered valuable. You don't get to pick and choose 5 and go, well, that's pretty close. All 6 are required for a valuable experience. That should tell us a lot. It's a great way to think about our content and say, am I delivering on all 6 of these things? Specifically in our space, I like to think slightly smaller and think about 4 overriding principles, which is comprehension, control, feedback, and flow. Now, these are exactly what they sound like. Comprehension. Can the user understand the stuff? Can they see what they're doing and why they're doing it and understand how to move forwards? Really, really simple. And yet, how many pieces of content have you accessed in your career and gone, I don't quite get what you're asking me to do here? It happens surprisingly often. We know it happens surprisingly often because that's how you end up with instructions like, click the next button to move to the next screen, which has never existed outside of anything e-learning related. I have never gone to a website and seen scroll down to see more of the web page. And yet, if we have a scrolling page in e-learning, I bet you there is going to be a little flashing arrow or a little mouse icon to tell people to scroll down. Strangely, we have forced that reality to exist by creating experiences that don't make sense to people. So now people start a piece of e-learning expecting to be confused. That's a real red flag to us that we have built ourselves a bit of a hole in terms of the user experience. When it comes to control, who has control of the experience once it's in the hand of the user? If the answer is us, we're in trouble. We get to design the experience. They get to go through it. It has to be that way. They have to have autonomy. If you want to look at that from a learning sort of theory perspective, if you look at things like self-determination theory, autonomous learning theory, there is evidence and growing support and evidence to suggest that autonomy plays a much larger role in effective transfer of knowledge and the ability to apply that knowledge in multiple contexts than we thought it did before. So when we're thinking about the design of experience, we always need to think about, in this moment, who's in control? Me, a system, or the user? And almost always it should be the user, the system, the user, the system, the user, the system, the user making decisions, the system providing feedback and nudges to move forwards. That should be the interaction. It should be like a conversation. Feedback is not necessarily what we tend to think of as feedback in L&D. It's not answer a question, hey, you got it right, hey, you got it wrong, though that is feedback. It's clear and timely information given in response to users' actions. Now, that could be clicking a button. How do I know what's happened next? The user should never be left alone, confused, and not knowing what to do next. They should always understand what's happened, what's coming, and what they're expected to do in any given moment. Now, there is some nuance to that, in that we do sometimes create experiences that are deliberately disorienting, but they should be going into that knowing that's what's going to happen. We're not actually creating these deeply immersive experiences where we actually want to disorient people in the office. That's not helpful. Might make us feel clever, but it's not actually helpful from a learning perspective. We know this. And finally, flow. You're probably all familiar with the idea of like the flow state. This is not quite tied to that, though it is very similar. So this is the idea that we want our users to be immersed in an experience that feels seamless, intuitive, and frictionless. So in UX, flow means reducing interruptions and distractions and minimizing unnecessary effort. We often refer to this as extraneous cognitive load. This isn't like not a thing in L&D. This is something we're quite familiar with. We want to focus attention and mental energy on what we actually want them to take away. New knowledge, the ability to contextualize it, the ability to apply it. We do not want them thinking, how the heck do I get back to the menu? Why is that section unlocked but not that section unlocked? Why is that button a totally different color to every other button in this course? These are all small things that we might think, well, it's just aesthetics. It may not be the branding. It may not be the usual approach to it. It's just a button. Who cares? We're human beings. We're drawn to stuff that isn't like the other bit. It will draw attention away from what's important. So we must always be considering the importance of really thinking about consistency. So I want to dive into some of the principles we can take from UX. These have been quite broad, and I want to dive into some really specific stuff with some examples. Some of these examples will be general internet-y examples, and others will be more sort of L&D specific. Let's dive in. The first grouping are cognitive and interaction principles, and we're going to kick things off with what's called Hick's law. Hick's law states that the more choices someone has, the slower they will be to make a decision. I think the single greatest example of this mankind has yet created is Netflix. It's possibly the single worst navigational system I have ever seen. It's just pages and pages and pages of thumbnails. It's utterly Mad. For an app that says you can find anything, I can't find anything at all. I can never find the thing that I want to watch, but I can always find Benidorm or whatever I don't want to watch at the minute. It's the classic example of, well, we've got loads of content, so we'll just give it all to them. That's a fantastic experience. Maximum user autonomy. Wasn't Tom just saying about how important autonomy was? This isn't autonomy, this is chaos. This is confusion guaranteed by design. Of course, that's exactly what Netflix wants. They don't want you to have an easy and quick time finding what you want to watch. They want you to spend the maximum possible amount of time on the platform. It's the same goal that TikTok has, they just approached it differently. TikTok has decided they just want to keep playing you more and more and more content, because that's how to keep you on the platform. Netflix has gone for a different model. It will take you so long to find the content you want to watch, you won't go to another streaming service. Meanwhile, you will be left feeling like you've got access to all the content in the world, despite none of it being the content you actually want. We don't want to do either of those things in L&D. We want to help people get to the right information as quickly and easily as possible, because navigating the LMS or the internal menu of a design of a piece of e-learning is not the point. If we could not have it, we wouldn't have it. But we have to have some form of navigation, and not everything can be linear. So we look to, how do we make this as simple as possible? How do we limit or manage choices to enable quick and accurate decisions? Because a quick but non-accurate decision isn't actually all that helpful either. So this web page is a really nice example of this. At the top, we've got a menu system with a couple of single click buttons. No more detail, you click it, you go to that place. But there's a slightly more to include in a section. We get a drop down. 3 very clear, same formatted options. No confusion so far. But under solutions, we've got a lot to talk about. And so we introduced the concept of the mega menu. Yes, that is the actual UI name for this. This is referred to as a mega menu for fairly obvious reasons. Now, it would be easy to look at that and say, that's a lot of options. That's a heck of a lot of options. But actually, it's nowhere near as overwhelming as the Netflix interface was. And there's a couple of things that have been done here from a design perspective to support the necessary number of options in a way that is easy for me to digest as a user. So the first thing is we've got 3 categories: products, industries, and integrations. And they've each got headings. They're also separated by color. They're also separated by column, although there are 2 columns giving over to industries in the middle. This, combined with a few other things, has established a very clear hierarchy for decision making. They clearly consider the product section to be where I start this. It's first in terms of order from the left. If this, of course, was in different parts of the world, you might want to localize it and start it from the right. I won't cover that kind of thing too much today. I'm not a localization expert. So for this, we're going to be Western focused. I apologize for anyone joining us from elsewhere in the world. So we're going to start from the left inherently. Products. We've also then got icons only in one group, the products group. Product also has the highest contrast color difference. Big, bold, dark blue. We don't really see that anywhere else on that original web page other than in the Contact Us button at the top. It's the bit that's not like the others. Then we move to the right. We've got industries. Stark change, white. Again, we don't see a lot of stark white on the web page except for the little cube button at the bottom. Then on the far end, we've got integrations. Same color as the background of the website. And furthest to the right, clearly section number 3. So ideally, yes, we want to limit choices to as fewer options as possible. But when we can't, We want to categorize and offer hierarchy to those decisions to enable people to take rapidly the steps to identify the right decision for them. It's always a tug of war because some things have a lot of options. Sometimes there are actually 8 topics we need in this build for whatever reason. Then we've got to decide, how do we help them navigate this? This touches on another law that we're not actually talking about in this session called Tesla's law, which is that everything has a sort of baseline level of complexity that you can't go below. Complicated things can only be made so simple. We are always trying to find that perfect line that it can be this simple, but still accurate, still useful, still usable. You dip below it, you actually start cutting away things that are important, separations that need to exist, content that needs to be gone over. But we go too far above it, we see bloat. We see, oh, well, 1 more topic, 2 more topics, 3 more topics. It's fine, it's not a problem. Until all of a sudden you're trying to assess them on the sum total of the world's knowledge of a subject. Scope creep is how we tend to talk about this. So that's Hick's law, super simple. There's another one that I always kind of consider to be sort of a real nice partner to Hick's law when it comes to talking about the number of choices and how that impacts speed of decision and accuracy of decision. And that is Fitt's law, that time to target is related to distance and size. Now, because we're looking mostly at e-learning, I'm going to focus really heavily on buttons, radio buttons, big buttons, menus, dials, things like that here. But you can kind of contextualize this to however you might want to use it. Basically, making the right decision quickly requires not just you to be able to pass the information, which we just discussed, but physically make the selection. And that sounds really obvious, but basically, bigger, closer, clearer targets create flow. If I'm not having to physically work hard to make the selection, then I'm focusing on the content, what we want them focusing on. I'm working the problem rather than trying to work the technology. Again, this sounds obvious, but we've all probably gone to a website where the buttons are really small, or use something on the mobile phone that doesn't work properly and the touch zones are a bit weird. They're too small, or they're in the wrong place, or only one side of the button works, or the text in the button isn't clickable, but the button body's clickable. That's one of my favorites. So this is an example from an app I'm working on at the moment. So you can see here that we've got these 2 quick actions at the bottom. They are common actions, the 2 most common things people go to this platform to do on this screen: finding a mentor and completing their profile. So they're grouped together. They're the quick actions. They are big buttons. That's a full 16:9 screen. They're taking up, probably half the width of the screen. They exceed the sort of accessibility requirements of 44:44 pixels minimum click and touch space. We should always be aiming for bigger than that anyway. And notably, if you were to load this on mobile, they would be physically easy to reach. And we'll touch more on that in just a moment. You've also then got a single option menu across the top, and then a standard kind of profile-y menu button in the top right. Little bit small, that possibly needs to be made a bit bigger. Now, I mentioned mobile devices. We're doing more and more for mobile devices now, moving more and more learning experiences into the mobile world. Luckily, this has been well explored for us, so we don't have to do this work. But we've all probably experienced stuff being in the wrong corner of the phone. The top corners, assuming you hold your phone and use it one-handed, is not easy to get to. The bottom corner nearest the palm you're holding it in is not easy to get to. So don't put stuff there. This is probably one of the simplest and yet most regularly overlooked things. Just put stuff where people can easily get to it, easily press it, and not confuse it with something else. And when I say something else, I'm talking about what might be considered dangerous decisions. In fact, what these are immutable decisions. So we've made everything big, or at least big enough, bigger than 44 by 44 pixels from an accessibility perspective on mobile devices, larger on desktop. We've put frequently used actions together and in easy to reach locations. We've grouped related actions together so that they make logical sense in where you can always find them. And we've avoided the edges and corners that are difficult to use for mobile users. But the last thing is to not put important interactions next to dangerous ones. So here you can see the danger zone, irreversible actions that will affect your account. Here, deleting it. But perhaps in our work, submitting questions in a summative assessment that you don't get a second attempt at. Taking a path in a scenario sort of pathway situation that you can't go back from, that will have a big impact. Ensuring that the user always knows when they are making an immutable decision. That's really, really important from a user autonomy perspective, but also just from a frustration perspective. If I can't change this once I click it, I need to know that before I click it. Unless that's the lesson, of course. Again, nuance to our context. But broadly speaking, immutable decisions should always be flagged as such. Probably not using the word immutable. It's not very helpful in common parlance, but it can help us with this. So I want to move on to visual and attention principles now. And I want to start with one called the von Restorff Effect. This one is probably the simplest thing that we're going to talk about today and something we probably already know, but it's nice to know there's some solid research to back it up. Things that stand out get remembered. Dead simple, probably not worth discussing, but again, I think this is a little bit like the desirable point we had at the start, where we somewhat misconstrue it. Things that stand out does not mean bold, random keywords in the middle of paragraphs of text. That, to me, is, oh, we wrote this, then realized we didn't emphasize this important information. Hopefully, if we bold it, they'll take note. That's hoping something stands out, not designing it to stand out. Our job is to design this experience, not write something and then figure out how to hopefully make certain bits of it stand out. Really simple example of this I will share with you now in this piece of example e-learning. There is absolutely nothing in here that is like not shareable. It's fully sanitized from the original client. Everyone has probably at some point created or at least been forced to attend some working safely at heights training. It's every instructional designer and e-learning developer's dream to create this kind of content. Naturally, we start it with the sentences around, oh, well, you know, this is really important training because if you fall off something high enough, you could die and not go home to your family. Yeah, that sounds a bit, but I know what we'll do. We'll bold that you might die bit in the middle of that paragraph. That'll make it stand out. That'll make it work. Or you could design for it to stand out. In this example here, that design is pretty on the nose. But then we are telling someone that we're trying to help them not die. So I think we're somewhat allowed to be on the nose with this one. So here we've gone with the big red box. We've gone with color. We've gone with separation. We've gone with the use of size and capitalization. We've gone with motion graphics and the slightly pulsing icons. We've used pretty much every trick in the book to say this thing here. I don't care if you don't read the next bit, pay attention to this. You might die. You want to see people get engaged real quick? Point that out to them in a meaningful way. Here you get a slightly more normal opening to a piece of e-learning where we give them a little bullet pointed list. So often this piece of information, this great big red box doesn't exist, but it's one of these bullet points down here. And then we wonder why no one pays attention. Another example down here. One of these squares is not like the other. Again, we've used a combination of things here. You could just use one. With these, we've gone real heavy. We've got motion graphics, color, size. We've changed the formatting. We've introduced different kinds of content using a capitalized subheading. We've also introduced additional proof. We have made this heavier by saying, here is the legislation link in the little lighter orange box to say, this is why this is important. There is a legal standard around this one that doesn't exist in the other two. We've boosted credibility. So when we talk about something standing out, yes, it could be visually, like these two examples, but it could also be because it's so much more credible than other things. We could use emotion to make something stand out. We could use tonality or medium to make something stand out if we're using audio or video. Stand out does not and probably shouldn't mean bolding or capitalizing keywords inside body text. If it's important enough to want to bold it, it's probably important enough to design to stand out rather than to hope that it stands out. Moving on to the next thing, we also have, similar vein, the aesthetic usability effect. Now, this drove me nuts for years. It still kind of irritates me now because it shouldn't be true, but it is. And that is that people perceive better looking designs as easier to use. If you doubt this to be the case, I point you towards the iPhone. The iPhone is beautifully designed, mostly. It's a pain to use if you haven't been using Apple for years and years. I switched this year and I am still trying to figure out how to do basic stuff that was very intuitive on my old Android phone. We often forget that ease of use is largely impacted by how long you've been using it for. Getting used to the things. Oh, well, this is how you go back. Well, I used to be able to just swipe the side of my phone. That made perfect sense to me. Why? Because I've been doing it for 10 years. Now I've got to press a button. Sometimes it's at the top and sometimes it's at the bottom and sometimes there's no button until I press the screen to reveal the button. How is that more intuitive than just swipe from the left or the right even? It's not intuitive to me, but it is to others. And the reason Apple gets the reputation for being easier to use and Android gets the reputation that it's harder to use is largely marketing. But that marketing is driven by the fact that undeniably, I think, though I am a diehard Android fan, Apple has done a better job of making iOS aesthetically pleasing to most people. There is a reason the Android look and feel looks more and more like an iPhone every year, because it works. It doesn't actually make the thing easier to use, but I like to think of it as smoothing the adoption curve. People are more willing to put in the effort to make it easier for themselves to learn because it looks beautiful. People like pretty things. They want them to be good because they like the way they look. Luckily, there are some easy things that we can steal around this. Use of white space, alignment, and visual hierarchy. And I've got another e-learning example for this, and I'll send you all in that email tomorrow. I'll send you a link to both these examples. They're readily available and online. But this one's quite cool because it allows us to toggle between a good and a bad example. Hey, look, it's GDPR training. I picked all the most exciting topics that we all love to train for these today. Does anyone want to throw in any ideas of what's immediately aesthetically not pleasing about this? Thinking specifically about use of white space, alignment, and hierarchy. Text alignment, titles are misaligned. So we've definitely got some big alignment problems. Anyone got any other sort of immediate thoughts other than alignment? Man's shoulder under woman's head. I can't see that part of the screen. It's behind my camera, but the image, the photo itself may not be a great choice. Absolutely. Body font size, hard to read over the image. Color contrast isn't clear against the background. Title size, lousy contrast of text. Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of problems here. So with these examples, I'm specifically looking at white space alignment hierarchy. But when we switch it over, we see that we've made a few key changes to just the content. The picture is not great, but it's the picture that was there when I created the demo. So GDPR compliance and mastery course have gotten bigger. They've also been center aligned. Say what you like about center alignment. It's quite easy to work with for titles. But notably, the two pieces of text, the white and the blue, have come closer together. We've reduced the line height. If you go back to where it was, then back to here, they've got a bit closer together. They feel now like they pair together. They're not separate lines. They're part of the same title. Then we've got our body text underneath, and we've got our buttons. Our buttons are now the same size. They're center aligned, and there's slightly more space between the two buttons, reducing the likelihood of a misclick. Immediately, if you land on this versus this, you are more likely to follow the little arrow instruction, which is also now bigger and aligned properly, and scroll down. We won't go through this whole thing. You can have a look at it yourself, but here you see a lot of the same story. You see left alignment in body text, which I like, but it all just feels a little bit messy. It feels out of proportion. These shapes feel odd because we're not used to seeing things stretched in too far horizontally versus vertically, and information too close to the edge. We're kind of playing with margins and padding here, but you can see the huge space difference we take up here by adding in a lot more white space. Move it back to how it was. We can practically see half the next section. Everything feels cramped. Everything feels like it's been pushed into too small a space. We move back to the good design. We see a much cleaner, more modern layout. We see that every element has gotten sufficient padding. The margins have been brought in from the edges of the screen. Everything sits comfortably on the screen. Now, that is unfortunately not a tick box exercise. There is no make it comfortable instruction. But what we can do is think about how we use grids and rows and layout plans when designing our content. We should almost always be thinking about any screen we design for in the same way that a web developer or an app developer does, in terms of where does it sit on the grid. Now, I want to whip through these last sections so that we can cover off any questions, and that's with language and emotion. I usually like to do a few things in this section, but in this I'm going to focus on the one that I think we get wrong the most in e-learning design, which is microcopy. Microcopy drives me absolutely nuts. These are the small instructions that we leave. These are the error messages that are essential for guiding someone through an experience. Now, error messages on a computer might be critical error, unhelpful. But in e-learning, they might be, actually, that's incorrect. Here's some feedback. But what next? What does that mean? What does getting this question wrong mean for me? The whole point of microcopy is to guide someone through the experience to ensure they're never lost, alone, or confused. And so we talk about clarity, context, and action. In any given moment, we should be providing necessary instruction to ensure people have total clarity on what's happening, what's about to happen, and what's expected of them. It should always be contextual. We should not necessarily have default microcopy for every piece of e-learning we write, because sometimes the context is different. So we should contextualize to the audience and the situation they find themselves in. Let me switch back to my slides. There we go. And finally, microcopy should always define the required action. If someone's expected to do something, we should be telling them what's expected of them. Now, notably, microcopy does not need to be that annoying sentence of click the next button to move to the next screen, if that is not required. Sometimes it is. I've been in situations where if you take it away, Users are so unconfident in navigating e-learning experiences, they worry about clicking the next button. That tells you that that team, unfortunately, has pumped out absolute crap into their organization because people are scared of clicking a next button because they don't know what's going to happen. That's a real red flag to us as an industry to say we need to do a heck of a lot better. That does not inspire confidence. What it also tells us is if that's what our users are telling us they need, that's what we should be providing. I mentioned at the start nuance and context being really important to this. Understanding your users defines what kind of microcopy you need to provide. It's essential that you understand the intended user of your content to make any of this useful. It can't be blanket applied. It just isn't that simple. Wish it was, but our lives would be a lot easier. So microcopy, biggest thing we can do to fix a lot of the interactions, that we create would be to provide better microcopy, better immediate, timely feedback to the user. Practical stuff, testing and sharing. What can you go and do? I mentioned at the start, we're not going to be overhauling the world of L&D after a 1-hour webinar. The whole point of this session is to get people thinking about user experience and how they might be able to apply it. My advice, start simple. Start with 3 very, very small things. Can I give them fewer choices without impacting autonomy? Am I using consistent buttons? When I say buttons, I mean all things interactive, radio buttons, dials, knobs, whatever you're putting into your content. Is there a clear visual hierarchy in this experience? In short, are people lost, alone, or confused? Fewer choices, consistent buttons, visual hierarchy. Not on everything, not all at once, and not with perfection in the first attempt. You define the smallest possible thing you can do, and you test it. Speaking of the smallest possible thing you could do, I'm particularly a fan of the 5-second test. Can your intended user say what they're expected to do after looking at a screen for 5 seconds? That doesn't mean knowing the answer to the question. It doesn't mean knowing the content after 5 seconds. That would be insane. It means looking at a screen and going, oh, okay, I just need to click the next button once I've read this. Or I need to answer that question and click submit. Or I need to click on those 7 elements, then it'll allow me to move on. If they can't identify the interaction you're asking them to be involved in within 5 seconds of arriving, something is wrong. Design for those 5 seconds of arrival. Now, I want to finish by talking about the serial position effect, which is that most of us in most experiences have a higher chance of remembering what was said at the beginning and what was said at the end, and very little of what was in the middle. And for that reason, I need to tell you about something before I get to the end. And that is that tomorrow you're going to get an email. In that email will be a recording of this session. There will also be a free downloadable handout aimed at making all of this a little bit easier to implement and try out, some ideas for experiments on how you can try out different UX principles in your work. There will also be the ubiquitous feedback form asking what you thought of the webinar, was it helpful, what was missing, what would you like to see in future webinars, all that kind of stuff. You can put in there that Google Meet is probably not an ideal platform because the chat doesn't seem to work. We'll try and fix that for next time, I promise. And the last link in that is an optional link to learn more about our Better by Design course, which is all about UX for L&D. We're not going to put any of that in the body of the email. You can learn more about it if you're interested. So with all of that sort of stuff out of the way, let's get to that end so we can make use of the serial position effect. And that is when I tell you that the value of this hour is not what you take in now. It's what you do differently after you leave. It's lovely spending time with you this afternoon, but it is entirely wasted if we all just go, ah, yes, well, absolutely, and back to how we were doing things before. So please try and find 5 minutes in the rest of your day today to just think about What the smallest little thing is that you can try, test, and experiment with from this session, even if all that is wanting to research one of the things that's been talked about.